Becoming whole involves using latent talents that can be learned or developed, usually only with a great deal of practice, and often only with the maturity required to allow humility to work on our weak sides. One crucial way that we become whole is by learning from others. Having role models helps prevent us from having to learn everything from scratch, so to speak. Since if we are good listeners and observers, we can avoid some of the pitfalls that someone else has experienced on the same path we are walking. But we must choose wisely whom we emulate, because role models may be detrimental at times. In childhood, one of the roots for learning, for better or worse, is through our parents as our primary role models. In adulthood, we have the opportunity to make a deliberate choice of role models, including not only how to choose good role models, but even how to appropriately use negative role models to serve as examples of what not to do. The subject of continuing learning is a matter of great importance, not only for individuals, but for groups. In trying to unlearn old patterns of behavior and enter into new processes of learning, the entire group will experience some emptiness. It is a phenomenon I have witnessed many times. For the past dozen years, the greatest adventure of my professional life and learning has come from working with others in the Foundation for Community Encouragement, or FCE. It is the mission of FCE to teach the principles of community, by which we mean the principles of healthy communication within and between groups. FCE teaches groups how to be healthy and whole, even holy. When groups are healthy, the individual members are in an environment where they can learn more effectively and efficiently about themselves and other people than any other place. The group itself also learns. Although it takes a great deal of work, including the work of unlearning, a group can develop a consciousness of its own, which is wiser and greater than the sum of its individual members. Such groups can become extraordinarily effective decision-making bodies. Our work at FCE has dovetailed with that of Peter Senge at the Organizational Learning Center at MIT. In his book, The Fifth Discipline, Senge coined the term learning organization, which is synonymous with what we at FCE call sustainable community. A learning organization must be a community. A sustainable community will be a learning organization. The key issue, however, is this matter of continuing learning. It is comparatively easy for organizations to learn temporarily when they are facing some kind of a crisis. What is not so easy is to learn continually. We believe that groups can begin to integrate a new perspective about learning when it is seen more as an opportunity for individual and collective growth than simply a burden to be tolerated. We have gained glimpses of how to teach this, but only glimpses. The field is a true frontier. Part 2. Wrestling with the complexity of everyday life. Part of the complexity of life is that at one and the same time we are individuals, members of family and work organizations, and of society. Indeed, it is almost arbitrary to separate these categories, but it is sometimes necessary to make such distinctions in order to talk about anything in depth. Therefore, as we begin to discuss some of the complex choices we must make in our hearts and minds, let me focus first upon what I believe to be the most critical choice. As always, consciousness precedes choice. Without it, there is no choice. The single most important personal choice that we can make is the choice for ever-increasing consciousness. Consciousness, however, does not make choices easy. To the contrary, it multiplies the options. Consider, for example, how we might deal with our anger. In the midbrain, there are collections of nerve cells, or centers, that not only govern but actually produce our powerful emotions. One of these is an anger center. In Further Along the Road Less Traveled, I wrote that the anger center in humans works in exactly the same way as it does in other creatures. It is basically a territorial mechanism, firing off whenever any other creature impinges upon our territory. We are no different from a dog fighting another dog that wanders into its territory, except that for us human beings, our definitions of territory, or boundaries, are so complex and multifaceted. Not only do we have a geographical territory and become angry when someone comes uninvited onto our property and starts picking our flowers, but we also have a psychological territory, and we become angry whenever anyone criticizes us. We also have a theological or an ideological territory, and we tend to become angry when anyone casts aspersions upon our belief systems, even when the critic is a stranger to us and speaking into a microphone thousands of miles away. We must learn a whole complex set of ways of dealing with anger. Sometimes we need to think, my anger is silly and immature, it's my fault. Or sometimes we should conclude, this person did impinge upon my territory, but it was an accident, and there's no reason to get angry about it. Or, well, he did violate my territory a little bit, but it's no big deal. It's not worth blowing up about. But every once in a while, after we think about it for a couple of days, we may discern that someone really did seriously violate our territory. Then it may be necessary to go to that person and say, listen, I've got a real bone to pick with you. And sometimes it might even be necessary to get angry immediately and blast that person right on the spot. So there are at least 5 different ways to respond when we're angry. And we have to learn which response is appropriate in any given situation. This requires extraordinary consciousness of what is going on both inside and outside of ourselves. It is no wonder that very few people learn how to deal well with their anger before they are into their 30s or 40s, and many never learn to do so constructively. To grow, we must learn to discern between that which is self-destructive and that which is self-constructive. When I was in practice, after about 5 sessions, I would no longer allow any of my patients to use the word unselfish. I would tell them that I was a totally selfish human being who had never done anything for anyone else. When I watered my flowers, I did not say to them, "Oh, look, flowers, what I'm doing for you. You ought to be grateful to me." I was doing it because I liked pretty flowers. Similarly, when I extended myself for one of my children, it was because I liked to have an image of myself in my mind as a reasonably decent father and a reasonably honest man. In order to maintain those 2 images side by side with any integrity, every so often I had to extend myself beyond what I might normally feel like doing. Besides, I also like pretty children. The truth is that we rarely do anything without some gain or benefit to ourselves, however small or subtle. Selfishness isn't always a simple matter. What I would do was ask my patients to distinguish between the path of smart selfishness and the path of stupid selfishness. The path of stupid selfishness is the path of trying to avoid all pain. The path of smart selfishness is trying to discern which pain or suffering particularly emotional suffering, is constructive and which is unconstructive. My preferred words for constructive and unconstructive suffering are, respectively, existential and neurotic. Existential is that which is an inherent part of existence and cannot be legitimately avoided, such as the suffering involved in growing up and learning to be independent, the suffering involved in learning how to become interdependent and even dependent again, the suffering that is associated with loss and giving up, the suffering of old age and dying. From all of these kinds of suffering, we have a great deal to learn. Neurotic suffering, on the other hand, is that emotional suffering which is not an inherent part of existence. It is unconstructive and unnecessary, and rather than enhancing our existence, impedes it. What we need to do with neurotic suffering is get rid of it just as quickly as possible, because it is like carrying 98 golf clubs around the course when all you need is 10 or 12 to play a perfectly good game. A significant part of the existential suffering of life is the suffering involved in constantly discerning or choosing what we are responsible for and what we are not responsible for, and maintaining a healthy balance. The character-disordered person avoids that existential suffering. What may not be so obvious is that the neurotic also does. By simply assuming that everything is her responsibility, she will ultimately suffer more through neurotic suffering, even though she does avoid the existential suffering of having to make choices, the kind of suffering that may be involved in saying to people, "No, I'm drawing the line." Discipline is the means for solving life's problems. All discipline is a form of submission. The discipline to discern what we are or are not responsible for is most crucial, since we must go through the existential suffering of choosing when and what to submit to and what not to submit to, whether it is to our own egos, to love, to God, or even to the forces of evil. Ultimately, we have to choose whether or not to submit to God, and indeed even choose the kind of God that we are going to submit to. The term higher power was coined, or at least initially popularized, by the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. In A World Waiting to be Born, I wrote that the term implies that there is something higher than us as individuals, and that it is appropriate to submit ourselves to that something higher, be it love, light, truth, or God. Thy will, not mine, be done, is a glorious expression of desire for such submission, and the key word is will. God is light, God is love, God is truth. People need not be believers in God, but if they are to be healthy, they must submit themselves to these attributes of God. Submission to the light might be defined as submission to the choice of consciousness, and hence sight, both external sight and particularly insight. Then there is the choice of whether to submit to love or not. In The Road Less Traveled, I defined love as the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth. This definition is an acknowledgement that love is far broader than romance, marriage, or parenting. There are numerous paradoxes related to love that test the myths and common thinking in our culture. For instance, we have all been told that it is better to give than to receive. I believe it would be more appropriate to say that it is just as good to receive as it is to give. Yet many have neurotic guilt over this issue and feel compelled to live up to cultural or religious ideals about charity that potentially promote more bitterness and friction than love in the true sense. We have also been taught that love is gentle, love is kind. And yet there are times when we must display what is called tough love. The reality is that we cannot love well if we are constantly extending ourselves to others and not nurturing ourselves. Submission to love does not mean being a doormat. Due to cultural indoctrination, many people equate love with doing. They feel they have to do something simply because of their own or others' expectations. The paradox is that many times just doing nothing, just being who you are rather than constantly focusing on what you do, is the more loving approach. Along with the choice of how much and what kinds of responsibility we will assume, we must also face the choice of vocation. To most people, vocation simply means what one does for a living, one's occupation or career. The secular definition of vocation usually implies only income-producing activity. The religious definition, however, is more literal, yet far more complex. It literally means calling. In this sense, vocation implies a relationship. For if someone is called, something must be doing the calling. I believe this something is God. God calls us human beings, whether skeptics or believers, to certain, often very specific activities. It is quite obvious that while one person may be called to be a homemaker, another may be called to be a lawyer, a scientist, or an advertising executive. There are different kinds of career callings, and for many, there are sequential callings. But what is less obvious are the spiritual and ethical issues relevant to one's vocation. As a scientist, am I called to work on weapons development? As a lawyer, am I called to defend someone I suspect is guilty? As a gynecologist, do I or do I not perform abortions? Just as some discover that certain aspects of their vocation do not fit or feel right to them, others spend years, even a lifetime, fleeing their true vocation. A 40-year-old sergeant major in the Army once consulted me for a mild depression that he ascribed to an upcoming reassignment to Germany in 2 weeks' time. He and his family were sick and tired of moving, he claimed. It was unusual for top-ranking enlisted men or officers to seek psychiatric consultation, especially for such a minor condition. Several other things were also extraordinary about this man. People do not get to be sergeant majors without considerable intelligence and competence. But my patient exuded wit and gentility as well. Somehow I was not surprised to learn that painting was his hobby. He struck me as being artistic. After he told me he had been in the service for 22 years, I asked him, "Since you're so fed up with moving, why don't you retire?" "I wouldn't know what to do with myself," he replied. "You could paint as much as you wanted," I suggested. "No, that's just a hobby," he said. "It's not something I could make a living at." I requested that he bring samples of his most recent paintings to our next appointment the following week. He brought 2, one in oil and the other a watercolor. Both were magnificent. They were modern, imaginative, even flamboyant, with an extraordinarily effective use of shape, shade, and color. When I inquired, he said that he did 3 or 4 paintings a year, but never attempted to sell any of them, only gave them away to friends. "Look," I said, "you've got real talent. I know it's a competitive field, but these are saleable. Painting ought to be more than just a hobby for you." "Talent's a subjective judgment," he demurred. "So I'm the only one who's ever told you you have real talent?" "No, but if you keep looking up in the sky, your feet are bound to stumble." I then told him it seemed obvious that he had a problem with underachievement, probably rooted either in some kind of fear of failure or fear of success, or both. I offered to obtain for him a medical release from his assignment, so that he could stay on post and we could work together exploring the roots of his problem. But he was adamant that it was his duty to proceed to Germany. I advised him how to get psychotherapy over there, but I doubt he took my advice. I suspect his resistance to his obvious vocation was so great that he would never follow the call, no matter how clear or loud. Given our free will, we have a choice to refuse to heed God's calling for us. The fact that we have a vocation doesn't necessarily mean that we will follow it. Conversely, the fact that we want to do something, or even have a talent for it, doesn't necessarily mean that it is what God wants us to do. Yet another important choice we have in our individual lives is the choice of how to regard the things that happen. I am thinking especially of the happy surprises we didn't expect. It is easy to take a lot for granted in this life, including good luck and unexpected gifts. Indeed, in this remarkably secular age, we are actually encouraged to think in terms of luck, as if good fortune has no more meaning than a roll of the dice. Yet there is another way to look at good luck and unexpected gifts. This theory posits a superhuman giver, God, who likes to give gifts to human creatures because he particularly loves us. Whether this God has anything to do with the downpours in our lives is uncertain, although in retrospect they often seem to have been blessings in disguise. As to those things that are recognizable gifts, some of us see a pattern of beneficence to them, far greater and more constant than any pattern of misfortune. For this beneficent pattern of gift-giving, we have a name: grace. If something is earned, it is not a true gift. Grace, however, is unearned. It is for free. It is gratis. The words grace, gratis, and gratitude flow into one another. If you perceive grace, you will naturally feel grateful. A story told to me by a famous preacher involved a young Yankee who, on a business trip, had to drive through the South for the first time in his life. He had driven all night and was in a hurry. By the time he arrived in South Carolina, he was really hungry and stopped at a roadside diner. He ordered a breakfast of scrambled eggs and sausage, and so was taken by surprise when his order came back and there was a white blob of something on the plate. "What's that?" he asked the waitress. "Why, them's grits, sir," she replied. "But I didn't order them," he said. "You don't order grits, sir," she responded. "They just come." And that, said the preacher, is very much like grace. Grace is like grits. You don't order it, it just comes. In my experience, the ability to appreciate pleasant surprises as gifts tends to be good for one's mental health. Those who perceive grace in the world are more likely to be grateful than those who don't. And grateful people are more likely to be happy than ungrateful ones. They are also more likely to make others happy. Feeling given to by the world, they feel predisposed to give back to the world. An attitude of gratitude may not entirely be a matter of choice. Indeed, it is my belief that a grateful heart is itself a gift. In other words, the capacity to appreciate gifts is a gift. It is also the greatest blessing a human being may possess, other than a strong will. But that doesn't mean that a grateful heart cannot be nurtured by choice. The final choice of our lives on this earth is whether or not we go out in style. It's not a matter of whether to die, but how. We have a lifetime to prepare. But unfortunately, the denial of aging in our culture goes hand in glove with the denial of death. As I make clear in my forthcoming book, Denial of the Soul, When I say dying in style, I do not mean taking the route of euthanasia. Euthanasia basically involves trying to make something clean that is inherently messy. It is, in my opinion, an attempt to shortcut the existential and legitimate suffering of dying, thereby shortcutting the opportunity for learning and growth. To die gracefully, I believe, is to make the choice to see dying as a learning opportunity and to welcome the stripping away of life as a cleansing so that the true dignity of the soul can shine through. Death is the ultimate emptiness, but there are other kinds of emptiness that we can deliberately choose throughout life. There are many varieties of emptiness, but the most important and the easiest to speak about without getting too mystical is the emptiness of not knowing. Despite living in a society that appears to push a know-it-all mentality and label those who don't always seem to be in the know as incompetents, we still have a choice to not know without feeling incompetent or guilty about it. In fact, there are times in each of our lives when it is not only proper, but healing to give up thinking we know all the answers. Although there is no certain formula, there is a guideline to help at particularly difficult times in life when we seem to have no idea what step to take next or whom to turn to. It is to recognize that the unconscious is always one step ahead of the conscious mind. The problem is, we don't know whether it's ahead in the right direction or the wrong direction. We don't always know if that still small voice we hear is the voice of the Holy Spirit, or Satan, or just our glands. It is therefore impossible ever to know that what we are doing is right at the time, since knowing is a function of consciousness. However, if your will is steadfastly to the good, and if you are willing to suffer fully when the good seems ambiguous, which to me seems about 98.7% of the time, then your unconscious will always be one step ahead of your conscious mind in the right direction. In other words, you will do the right thing, but you won't have the luxury of knowing it at the time you are doing it. Indeed, you will do the right thing precisely because you've been willing to forego that luxury. And if this guideline seems obscure, then you might want to remember that almost all of the evil in this world is committed by people who are absolutely certain that they know what they're doing.